Let's take a look at setting up your audio device within Studio One 3. Now in order to do this, we'll need to come to Studio One if you're on the PC up top and choose Options. Alternatively, we can use the shortcut keys, Control comma, and bring it up here. We'll then want to come to the audio setup. This first drop-down menu is then where we can access all of the different audio interfaces available to us. I am currently using the Focusrite Scarlett Solo. It's a 2-in, 2-output USB audio interface. And so whichever you're using, you would just want to choose it here. If you're on the Mac, you can choose Core Audio. If you don't have an external audio card, it's probably going to default to that anyway. You can also use Windows Audio if you do not have an external audio card and you're on the PC. Now, with each external audio interface, there's usually an additional control panel. We can access that by clicking the control panel. And here I can adjust my buffer size. I'm on a slower computer, so 128 is about as low as I can go before I start to hear clicks or pops and other distortion in my audio. So if you are experiencing that, then this is one area that you would want to look at and raise up the buffer size until you can get rid of that. But ideally, if you're going to be recording, you want to have this set as low as possible. 128 is kind of a bare minimum where you can get away with, say, playing a MIDI keyboard and not introducing too much delay. Ideally, 64 and below is going to be much better. So I will go ahead and close out of there. Below that, we can then see our device block size, which corresponds to our audio device. That's essentially what that is. The internal block size is specific to Studio One 3, and we can actually adjust this separately within the software to be lower or higher than what our audio interface is. In order to do that, we would just uncheck that lock. We can then choose a different internal block size here. Now, again, as with lowering the buffer size in the audio interface, you could introduce clicks and pops and things of that nature. Once you lower this internal block size, it is going to stress the processor just the same as your audio device would. So if we take note of the CPU meter here, and I lower this from 128 to, say, 32, you can see we start to get a lot of activity on the processor there. So if you're having issues, recording and you're getting distortion, then you'll want to take a look at this. If you have unchecked the lock and raise that back up, you can see the activity's gone down a bit with our processor. But I typically keep this locked. Now, process precision is 32-bit, and this is specific to Studio One. Since I'm using Prime, it is kind of stuck at 32-bit, but if you're using Studio One 3 Professional, then you will have a drop-down menu here where you can choose 64-bit to get double process precision. Enable multiprocessing, and below that we can choose how many of the cores that we're going to be using. I can't think of any reason why you would not want to use all of the processing power available to you. Unless you're having some sort of weird problems, then you may want to uncheck those. Below that, we can see our input latency. For me, being on a slower computer, I'm at 9.9 milliseconds for input, and output is 9.9. Our sample rate is 48 kilohertz, and the bit depth is 32. And this is, again, internal within Studio One 3. Your audio interface is going to dictate what the audio is recorded at as far as that part of the chain is concerned. So the Scarlett Solo, my audio interface only records at 24-bit, but within Studio One, we're getting processing at 32. So now, in order to adjust the sample rate, we can come to the song setup here and access that. Also, you can come to song setup, And then under the General tab here, we can choose a different sample rate. We can also choose a different resolution here, and this is going to be specific to the song and within Studio One. This does not change the audio interface bit depth. Now, one thing to keep in mind when you're working with these is that the sample rate, the higher you go, the more processing power is going to be required. So you're going to stress the processor the higher you go with the sample rate. The higher the resolution for a bit, that is going to create larger file size. Now, this is the typical setting that I use for recording, 48 kilohertz at 24-bit. And I think that the audio quality is just fine. There's lots of arguments about what's the best sample rate. Some people say higher is better, but I think 44.1 or 48 is just fine. Now, while we're in the song setup window, let's go ahead and take a look at the audio routing. And how are we going to get that audio from the inputs of your hardware interface to an actual track within Studio One? Now, let's click on the audio I/O setup in order to look at that. And as I mentioned, the Scarlett Solo is 2 inputs and 2 outs. So I've got input 1 and 2 available to me. If your audio interface has 8 inputs, then you should see those going across horizontally across the top here. That's going to represent the physical inputs on your audio interface. Here to the left vertically, this is going to represent what you will see within the DAW itself when you're adding a track and choosing what input. So we can rename these. So that's a stereo input because we're capturing input 1 and 2 physically on the hardware interface. That's what that represents. You can see we also have these 2 bars here. This is actually a meter. So if you have your mic connected and your gain adjusted correctly, you should see level meters going up and down here. So this can help you with naming your inputs while you're setting up. And I'm just going to call this mic 1 and this other one line. Now, in order to bridge these connections, say if I were to add a track within Studio One and choose mic 1, in order to bridge that with input 1 on my audio interface, we do need to have this block in here. And if you can tell, the resolution may not allow you to see that, but that's a M there, which indicates mono. Because this is a mono input, we have that single meter there. So you can only choose one or the other. Now for our stereo, we have L and R for left and right, which corresponds to the input 1 and 2 on my audio interface. But this is how you bridge those connections. You need to have something there. So since I've removed that block, if I chose line 1 within the sequencer here, or the arranger, I'm not going to have any audio because that connection is not bridged for the line that I would choose to input 1 or 2. So what does this look like within? Well, secondly, we got the outputs here. So, and just the same as the inputs, we can double click and name our outs. There's a Q-Mix here, which we'll take a brief look at in a second. If you are using another version of Studio One, then you will see additional buttons down here. And because I'm using Studio One Prime, those are not available. But what I'm going to do is hop over to Studio One 2.6 Producer Edition, and then we'll take a look at what those extra buttons are, what they're used for. But before we do that, just know that when you have made all of this connections, renamed everything as you would like it, go ahead and make that as your default. So in this way, whenever you create a new song, you don't have to go through this process each and every time. It will just then be your default settings, and you don't have to worry about doing that. So, but let's take a look at Studio One 2.6 Producer and take a look at those extra buttons real quick. Now, as we can see here in my version of Studio One 2.6 Producer, we now have these additional options available down at the bottom. all the way to the left here, we can click to add a mono track and then select which channel we're going to use on our hardware interface. Of course, we can rename and remove there. We can add another stereo input. I'm just going to go ahead and remove that new one, and let's move over to the Outputs tab. Here we have the same buttons below, but we also have an Audition button. Now what is that? If we add an extra stereo out, we can then choose that from this drop-down menu. And this corresponds with the audio output of the Audition feature here in the browser. So when you're going through your samples and you're listening to them, you can have them go to a different sound source that is going to be different than your main mix. I hope that makes sense. So you would then create that additional output, choose the outputs on your hardware device. Now I only have two because I'm using the Scarlett Solo. I only have two outputs on there, so this is kind of moot for me, but that's what you would then use it for. If you have an audio interface that has, say, 8 outputs, then you can assign the Audition outputs to go to 3 and 4 for whatever reason you may want to do that. Now I won't go too much into the QMix right now because that's a bit beyond the scope of this video, but just know that this allows you to create separate mixes with different levels and panning for if you have a group of musicians that you're recording. You can select that QMix and then route this to, say, a drummer if he wants the other instruments lower than his, or however. This would be available to you in the mixer, and you can adjust the level and panning by choosing this QMix here. And I'll do a video detailing how that works in the future. And I'll go ahead and remove that new one. Now coming back, I'm going to close the song setup window, and let's go ahead and create a track. I'm going to press T on my keyboard, and we'll create 2 mono tracks. I'm going to click OK. And I just want you to see how what we renamed in the setup area for the audio is what we see here now. When we renamed to mic 1, and we also named line. So if I choose this drop down menu, this is where we choose our inputs, what we're going to be using. So this is our line, which corresponds to the physical input 2 on the Scarlett Solo. So that's how we choose our inputs using these drop down menus here. Now if I press T again and create a couple of stereo tracks, you can see here it defaults to the stereo. We only have one available to us, which makes use of the physical 1 and 2 inputs on the Scarlett Solo. And at this point, if you made your adjustments to the gain control on your audio interface and you've got a good level there, you should be able to go ahead and arm your track. Monitoring will be turned on by default. If you do not wish to have that on, just click once, and then you would press record down here, and you should be able to record your vocals or other instruments that you'd like to get into Studio One.